Thank you, Carla. I'm really happy to be presenting here. This is the second time I think I've done an Odyssey conference. So really excited and happy to be back. So my name is Chris Kenst. I'm a lead automation engineer at a company called Promenade Group. Promenade, we basically help small local businesses get online. We work with small mom and pop florists. We work with liquor stores, pizza shops, and breweries actually to build e-commerce. We bring them onto our e-commerce platform and we help them get online sales, which it turns out to be pretty important in COVID. I'm also president for the Association for Software Testing. We are a global nonprofit that helps software testers develop skills. We offer a bunch of classes and a community of people that want to also get better at testing and help you have a great career. So again, very happy to be here. I want to talk a bit about this concept that I have, this idea of how many ways there are to automate a test. And so if you actually came to this talk for the literal answer to this question, if you're one of those people and you want the TLDR, just go with 100. And then thank you and have a great day. You can go now. But if you weren't here for the literal answer to this question, it's really not about a number. It's about a way to think about and dissect a particular problem that I've been dealing with, and I think a lot of other people do as well. So I am an automation engineer, but I spend a good deal of time hands-on with our products, exploring and testing. I also spend a good deal of time just wrestling with this problem of like, what tests should we automate? How do we automate? Where do we automate? There's this like overemphasis, I think, on a lot of this stuff. A lot of the details are lost. But even before I had the title of an automation engineer, I was always trying anytime I was testing, I was trying, and I do try and build and apply well-designed tests efficiently. One of the challenges that we face in software testing is just that there's always too much to test. And so you have to be able to find a way to do things efficiently. And a part of efficiency also is when you automate, are you automating efficiently? And so I just want to automate only the things that should be automated. So I kept having this question. I still have this question. What are those things? Like, what should be automated? And I needed to come up with a better model to help make those decisions. And I ended up making one. I think this model can help other people as well, hence why I'm doing this talk. And so here are a few things that I think might come of having a better model. So if this kind of works out, we'll understand the testing process better. We'll become more effective as testers. And hopefully we'll just kind of have a greater impact. So before I get into sharing what my actual model is that I created, I want to call attention to some of the problems that I ran into. And I think these are pretty common with regard to, how do we automate? And the first one is this really big holistic question, which is, what do you want to automate? Well, which part do you want to automate, right? Like, which part of the process, the testing process, do we actually want to automate? And it's a question that I know I don't ask enough, and I see people not asking enough either. So there are lots of parts of this testing process. Let's see if I can get it to trigger here. So these are just the parts that I was able to come up with when I was brainstorming on my own. So it's not a complete list. So I actually have a question for those of you that are watching this, whether you're watching it live right now or you're watching it later at some date. If you're looking at this and you're like, I think something's missing, comment on this video, ask a question, reach out to me and call it out, because I'm still working through this model and I'm trying to get better at it. So if you find something that you think is missing, definitely let me know. But this kind of goes to the scope of this problem of, if we want to think about how many ways are there to automate a test, we also need to think about, and we often fail to think about, like, what are the parts of the testing process that are actually out there? these are some of the ones that I came up with. There's designing a test, there's executing it, there's reporting on it. There are oracles. Oracles are huge. They're how we recognize problems. There's data that's involved. There are systems and people, and of course, observations, actual things that we are observing the software to do. And looking at that model kind of that way, looking at it, the whole testing process, it's a bit top down, but I know it aided in, or it does aid in how I perceive, how I like to look at systems, essentially. So like, where do I start? How do I kind of break down this problem? I like those big kind of models. And so not every test automation solution will address everything. So some will address execution, some will address data, some will address reporting, but not everything fits in all those buckets. But it's still a good idea to kind of have this overall idea of the whole process. Even if you're not using all those, you still kind of want to be aware of all the processes, all the parts of the process. And I think that by not focusing kind of top level on all these things, we tend to focus on just as a community, and I know that I did when I start thinking about this, is I tend to focus on the wrong things, or I build incomplete systems because maybe I'm thinking about executing tests, but I'm not adequately reporting those, and I'm not bubbling up or using the right kind of data. There's other problems as well. And just to call out too, I think it kind of limits our growth. So whether you're a tester or test engineer or an automation engineer, if you don't understand all the various parts of the testing process, I think it limits us and pigeonholes us, because if you only know how to, like, say, automate executing of tests, you are kind of putting yourself in a box, and you're just limiting your effectiveness and your growth. So again, kind of looking at that problem of not looking at the testing process top down, it creates some problems. But there's another problem that I want to bring up as well. And if we think about all those things that were listed on the previous slide: design, execution, reporting, data, oracles, which one of them do you think we focus too much on? And this is one that I definitely focus on too much myself. Well, I think it's execution. And specifically what I'm talking about is test execution. Everybody focuses too much on this. I know I do when I talk to other people about it, and when I see other people talking about it, when I see people writing about it, the focus is always on test execution. Now, if you remember back to that previous slide, there's like at least eight parts of the testing process. But one of the big problems is we just focus on test execution. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, this is a performance. This is carrying out. We see a lot of action with this. I know I see this all the time in Slack channels and on Stack Overflow and that kind of thing. These are commonly asked questions. It's like, well, how do I automate this, right? Like, I want to run some Selenium tests or run some UI tests. Like, how can I do that? Or I want to use this tool. How can I do that? Most of those are focused on how do we actually execute a test. I pulled these from a couple of websites, and I say they shall remain nameless, but they actually won't. Because if you look in the lower right-hand corner, that is actually I just took a screenshot from Wikipedia on the article for test automation. And the thing that it says is that basically test automation is software that controls the execution of tests. Now, this isn't actually the worst definition, because it goes on to say, like, you actually do compare actual outcomes with predicted outcomes. But that is a very common thing. So it's what is test automation? Well, it's focusing on the execution. And again, I think this is a problem. This other quote is actually an email that I got at the Association for Software Testing. A company wanted to partner with us to write some articles and share it with our membership. And I replied back, okay, but you have to better understand what test automation is. Otherwise, we don't want to work with you, right? Like, it's not about just control. And the problem with this is it's just missing important things. If you only focus on execution, you're missing important things. So if we go back to those quotes above, like I mentioned, Wikipedia mentions comparisons. Well, that's good. Like that's not the worst definition, right? Like comparisons are definitely important, and comparisons are part of our oracles or part of our reporting. But just focusing on test execution when we talk about how many ways are there to kind of automate something, it focuses us very narrowly. And it misses important things. Like one kind of obvious thing that we miss when we talk about just execution is test design. Like there are lots of different ways you can design tests, and you can automate a lot of those. And so if you're not running like UI or API tests, but you're actually in the thick of it and you're doing some, boundary analysis, or you're trying to like figure out what browser combination of things that you need based on your analytics, you can automate a lot of those things and it'll help you out a lot. The other thing is observing systems. This is a really big deal. I follow people on Twitter and they talk about using software to automate and help them observe how systems behave. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in. I think that has a huge potential impact on our day-to-day. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here by actually giving away part of what my new model is. But I think part of the problem of execution is it's just too narrow. I said that before. And I think what we should be focusing on is more control. So I'm a fan of mind maps. You'll notice that this is kind of a branching of a mind map. And as I started to think about this topic as well and think about execution, I broadened it to control. And as soon as I broadened it to the way that we can control software, I realized that I could start including more things in that. But we'll get to that later. So I've already thrown out a couple of problems. We don't look at the testing process or the whole testing process, and we focus too much on execution. Well, what are the solutions to that? Models are one of the solutions. So software is really complex. There's systems working together, and we need to be able to conceptualize and model those things so that we can understand that. I know I need to model things, and I think a lot of people do too. The people that I work with just regularly, they are all working from models. Some of them might be visual, some of them might just be mental. And when I do say models, I'm not talking about the model on the left here. I'm talking about the model on the right, just to clarify. It's kind of funny, but obviously, like we're talking about models, representations of how systems work. So these could be mental models, these could be visual models, some kinds of an aid or a helpful device. I do this all the time. I'll move from testing one thing in one particular context to going over and doing something else in a different context. And I'm always looking for ways to just help me remember what's important or remember what I should focus on. I think most everyone in testing has seen some form of the testing pyramid or test automation pyramid. This is a really common model. This is one from Alistair Scott, the ideal software testing pyramid. There's lots of models out there that we deal with as testers, whether they're like the automation or testing pyramid or the ice cream cone. I mean, there's probably got to be thousands of different variations that people have made. I think every content marketer has probably made their own version of this and put it on a website somewhere. Many of these models look like the test automation pyramid. Some people flipped it around and called it an ice cream cone and called it an anti-pattern. Kent Dodds made the testing trophy where he was like, no, focus more on the middle stuff and less on the things at the end. My favorite is this idea of a bandpass filter. And this is not an exhaustive list of models. We have heuristic test strategy model. We have risk catalogs, cheat sheets. Elizabeth Hendrickson's cheat sheet is still very popular. The problems that I've always faced when using these things is that they weren't helpful about helping me understand what parts of the testing process or what I should automate and what was even possible to automate with regards to tests. So I have another ask. So I asked in the previous examples that if you saw something within my testing process that I was missing, call it out, right? If you see part of the testing process, you're like, oh, you're missing this particular section, shout out a comment or find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, wherever. I have another ask. If there are other models that you found that are really helpful that you think help you understand what to automate and what not to automate, share it. I'd love to see it because most of the models that I've found have not been very helpful. And so another model that kind of prompted this whole discussion around, what are the different ways that we can automate a test was thinking about test techniques. So test techniques are a model for thinking about ways that we can design, run, and interpret tests. There are hundreds of them. This is literally the model that, and I actually have a mind map of this where I've got like 100 different test techniques all out there. But this is where I start to think about, well, listen, if there's all these different ways to design, run, and interpret the results of tests, how do I know how many ways are there to actually automate a test? There's got to be kind of a better way to organize and categorize these things. I like looking at this model because it lets me know that, there's unit tests and there's API tests, and those are kind of one particular thing, but they're different than, say, functional tests or combinatorial tests. And the design of those are different and the output of those are different. Like unit tests you would put under source control and run all the time, but combinatorial tests you probably wouldn't do that, even though you could both automate those things. And unit tests you would definitely want to automate. Combinatorial tests you would definitely want to automate as well. But those are different things. And so this is really what kind of prompted this question about what are the different ways that there are to automate a test. So again, looking at the existing models that are out there, they got me closer to understanding this concept of what I should automate and what I shouldn't. But basically, they left me with more questions than answers. As an automation engineer or as a tester, whatever kind of role that I'm in, I'm probably not going to write unit tests because, looking at that pyramid is great, but that's really specific and it's going to be written in a specific language. You have to know the architecture and the breakdown of the application. Most of my developers are probably going to write that. And yeah, like I could write some integration or API tests, but again, that's not super helpful. My camera likes to jump in and out sometimes. So again, that's not super helpful. These models get me a little bit closer, but again, they just kind of leave me with more questions than answers. So in the beginning, I said, well, how do we answer this question? Like we have these problems of not looking at the overall process and, focusing kind of too much on execution, and the existing models we have, they're nice, they're helpful, but they're not enough. And so I've made a new model, a better model that I think kind of helps aid in this decision. And it's been helpful in helping me start to answer these questions about ways to automate a test. And so hopefully you can see this and it's not too blurry. I definitely enjoy using mind maps. But here's a warning, this is incomplete. So this is where I'm at sort of right now. In this part of the process, this visualizing the testing process, this model has actually been really useful so far, but it's a work in progress. So this is tackling that kind of first problem of identifying parts of the testing process, the design, the control, the reporting. But I've already started to flip things and alter things in a way that I think makes it more useful. So I'd like to take a little bit, and we'll dive into kind of each one of these sections a little bit. If you're looking at this and you would like to have access to the mind maps, to this mind map, don't worry, I'll give you a link so people can download it. But I'd like to take a look at the various kind of parts of this. So I already talked about this a bit before, but when we focus on executing tests or even thinking about like all automated tests need to be in version control, I think that misses this point of how can we use software to create better, more efficient tests. This is a big part of the testing process, designing tests, like actually creating them. I know I overlook this all the time, but if you're, for example, I used this just a few minutes ago, but let's say you are looking at your analytics for your web page, your mobile app, and you're like, there's all these different browsers that people use your application on across all these different operating systems and devices. And you just kind of have this explosion of too many possible things to test. Well, that's what combinatorics is for. This is what platform configuration tests are for. You can automate, you can take all those individual variables and say, I want just, to pair up these things or to triple up these things. And I want you to narrow down all these possible choices and just give me a smaller subset so I can test. That's test design, and that's automating test design. So we can actually generate interesting combinations of things. I mentioned before that I work on e-commerce platforms. E-commerce, you have a funnel where you give people a picture or a product with a description of what they're about to buy. They add it to their cart, and then they go through that checkout process, which is familiar to all of us. You add something to your cart, you can add some more things, or you can just continue on, and then you put in your billing address, your shipping address, you pay for something. Well, it turns out that moving through that cart, there are lots of decision points where you can do something different. That's what we call path analysis or path testing. It turns out automated testing is really good for that, for figuring out, like, here are all the different ways that you can go back and forth through that flow. It's also called flow testing. Domain testing, we can automate the way we identify variables. Functional testing, we can actually exercise the variables. So this is a big part of the testing process and the test automation process that I think it's overlooked. I jumped the gun before when I started talking about, is it test execution or test or control? And so really what this is talking about is what part of the testing process can we automate where we can actually control with software. And again, I kind of mentioned this before. When I started thinking about execution, it wasn't super helpful for me. It was kind of limiting. And once I sort of realized that, it was more about what can we use software to control that's a part of our testing process. Well, when I started thinking about that, it was like, well, lots of things. Actually, you can control the configuration of your system. You can create data or generate data for use in your tests. You can set things up with regard to the systems that you're going to interact with. You can do more common things that we've seen, which is, based on an interface, a UI or an API. You can simulate input or action or do assertions. This is kind of the more typical thing, but by thinking about it as what part of the testing process can we control rather than focusing on execution, I think it broadens it and it gives us more ideas about how we can automate parts of this process. Another thing is around observing or observation. So how can we use software to better help us observe what's happening on our system, on the system under test, or even the input and output? And when I talk about observing, I'm not necessarily talking about observability. I know that's kind of a big thing right now, observability tools and being able to monitor. That's all good stuff. But specifically, I'm thinking of ways to, observe part of our system as we're testing it. So using software to help us automate those observations, building small tools that help us explore and better understand the systems, or even like a very small part of your system as you're testing. I think this is actually one of my favorite places right now of spending time. I follow people on Twitter. I read blog posts. I'm trying to find examples of this where people talk about it, because it's not nearly talked as often as it should be. Just like test design is kind of like ignored on the automation side, so is observing those systems, right? Like, what is actually going on? Are you monitoring, do you have a script running that's looking at all the processes that are happening on whatever Linux box or Windows box is happening? Are you monitoring like where data is moving around on your file system? Those kinds of nitty-gritty things that can potentially show us big problems. Those are things we can automate. Another big part of automating is analyzing. Like, how do we use software how do we automate the analysis or sense making of the input and output that we use? And I'm also talking about correctness. So how do we recognize whether something passed or failed or otherwise? So, this is part of this is identifying potential bugs and talking about the Oracle problem. I hope most everybody knows what an oracle is, but if you don't, they're mechanisms for recognizing problems. So there are lots of oracles. Some are better for automating, some are less good for automating. Doug Hoffman, Richard Bradshaw have recently done stuff in the last year or two on this. Most oracles that we used in test automation that I've seen are human oracles. Basically, the person is telling the machine, this is how you recognize a pass, this is how you recognize a fail. But there are other ways to go around about getting our systems to help us identify if things are pass or failing. You don't actually have to get a pass or fail. You can have a system go, these things look suspicious. You can have them give us non-deterministic responses. And the funny part is when I showed that visualization, my mind map, I actually forgot to put oracles on there. So I added that after I went through all my slides. I mentioned following people on Twitter. Ben Simo talks a bunch about this, about how he's using tools to observe and analyze the systems that he's testing. So I think this is another part of the testing process, another way we can automate testing in the part of the process that is unfortunately kind of overlooked. Reporting is probably one of the less overlooked places. So how can we use software to better report, alert, or store data from our tests or the system under test? I think a few people, at least one other person at Odyssey has talked about reporting. So it's, I think, a little more well-known part of the testing process that we can automate. But it's quite important. It's about getting information to people who can make a decision about it. Alerting, storing data into databases or data lakes, whatever, putting them into nice reports, or, literally just dropping them into Slack. This is an easier part to sort of automate, and an important part to automate as well. So let's kind of taking a step back now. We just kind of went through my visual model, and I'll show it to you again in just a minute. But the challenge of answering this question about how many ways are there to automate a test, I said it was more about the process and finding a model that would help me answer this question. So this model, this is what I put up on the screen before. So this model is actually helping me. This is helping me categorize things. I've found it useful so far, and I'm hopeful that it's useful to you. So definitely tell me if it is and where it's useful and where it's not. It's not perfect. It's very much a work in progress. I expect to, I'm using this actively as we speak at work to try and see where I need to focus and where I can better have impact. So with this model as it is right now, I can tell when I'm focusing too much on one aspect of automating the testing process and not enough on another. I can also bring this up and have discussions with my fellow testers and my developers about what it is that we're trying to accomplish when we automate something, right? Do we think we'll have more impact over here, or do we think we'll have more impact over here? I think people, they start to recognize when they repeat themselves a bit and they're like, oh, well, we should automate that. And you're like, yeah, we can control that, but there's probably also other things that we should be looking out for. Are there times when we're just, we're constantly doing this one type of activity, this, generating, doing this one kind of testing, where it turns out it would just be better if we had, we could generate a list of just the things we want to look for? Or are we not getting, we don't have enough oracles, we don't have enough ways to recognize problems or do the comparisons that we actually need to spend more time on. So I've found that this has been really beneficial for me to understand the testing process and have conversations and, give me feedback essentially on what it is. So I'm just kind of wrapping this up. I think Carla, I moved kind of quick on this. So we'll probably be ready for questions in just a few minutes. But if you want to get this model that I've built or any of the other mind maps that I've used, I've got a few on my website at kenst.com/resources. And just remember too that if anybody asks you what this talk was and they want to know actually what the literal answer to this question was, 100 is a good answer. It's a lie, it's not real, but I think it's kind of funny just when people look for a straight literal answer. So I think with that, I did move quick, but Carla, I think we're ready for questions if people have them.
Yeah, let's go ahead and start off with some questions. So our first user wants to know, if you were to ask to automate a website that components, if you were asked to automate a website, what components would you look for and how would you do it?
Yeah, so I think this is another one of these kind of general questions where you want to kind of look at what it is within on a website that we're talking about, right? So I think when people say like, oh, we want to automate a website, we're talking about control and we're talking about the interface, right? So we're talking about like, oh, we want to do this one thing on the website and it's probably focused on the UI. So anytime we start talking about like, what is our approach to automating something, the question should actually be like, well, what is it that we're trying to find out? Like, what is our goal so that we can build a strategy, right? Is that what was the question again?
The what components?
Yeah, what components? So there's lots of different components, right? So if you're looking at a website, there's obviously, you have a user interface. There are APIs and services that lead into that. So there's a lot of ways to kind of model and break down the problem. But your response to like what components should you use, it's going to depend on what your goal is. Are you thinking about doing functional testing where you're just trying to, test individual functions? Are you trying to do a scenario or a path through the application? If you're just trying to do functions, you don't even need a full working website. If you're trying to do a path or a scenario, you probably want all those pieces working together. So it depends on what you're looking for and what kind of things you're trying to do. Are you trying to design, like you're trying to come up with a way to automate the design of that, to automate the control of that? There's a lot of ways you can answer that. So it depends.
Awesome, thank you. Yep, so our next question wants to know what the components irrigation API test that you refer to, because it seems that people don't interpret those terms in the same way.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find a good way to categorize this as well. I call those interfaces. So integration API, those are, I also call them test techniques, right? So they are ways you can run and group and interpret tests in different ways. So what component? Yes, so they're all slightly different, but they have some similarities, right? So API tests or service or unit, those are all talking kind of about the layers of the stack on where you run them. Component tests as well. So components might be like visual components that you're testing and how they render. Anytime you start having a discussion around someone with these, it's a good idea to try and define what these terms are, because people might, like when I'm having conversations with my developers, they'll be like, well, UI tests are essentially integration tests. If you're having that discussion, you need to sort of try and understand what is the point of labeling these things this way. And, like, are you just lumping everything together? Is that okay? So I think anytime we start discussing those, I don't want to try and break those down right now. That's a whole conversation in itself. So anytime you're having those and you're worried that people are interpreting them the same way, that might be okay for your conversation, but it might not. So that's just a discussion you need to have.
Yeah, someone in the comments said that it could be platform specific or architecture specific as well.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, our next question says that I love the question of what to automate. There are so many features that we release and then don't touch them again. So is there any benefit in automating that end to end, especially considering automation maintenance and the servers running these automated tests and applications of storing these tests?
Yeah, so all of your, anytime you're automating something, so what part of the reason that I like visualizing this process is part of this work is we get into this idea of so like if you automate the design of a test, that's usually kind of throwaway work, but it's usually okay that it's throwaway because it doesn't take a whole lot of time to do. But as you say, like when you get into controlling tests and you're building like end-to-end tests, so that's like on my visualization, like that's controlling and you're trying to simulate the input and output. You do tend to keep those around and you do tend to spend a lot more time on building them. And you're right, then things change and you have to automate them. There is always going to be a question of, there's a great, what's the cartoon, the web cartoon, XKCD, which is, I think Randall Munroe is who writes it. And he created this diagram. It was like, how much time is this going to save you by automating versus how much time are you spending to invest in it? And that's always the question that you're going to have to ask. If you're not ever going to run something again this way, and you can do it in another way that is fit for purpose, then you should do that and you should not worry about automating it. And you can have that conversation around all these different things, right? So like when you, oracles, if you can automate them, they're probably worth the time to spend because they'll probably give you different information than you could gather on your own. Same thing with design. If you're going to design a test, you can just design it the one time and it's going to help you the rest of your day or week. But you don't need to maintain it and you don't need to do any of those things. So again, that conversation, we immediately kind of jump to like, oh, we want to be able to control tests. And if you're going to write tests that control these things, then there's this whole maintenance question. And you have to talk honestly about, is it worth that? Whereas some other parts where you may automate things like with design or maybe even observing, those might just be one-time throwaway things that you can do.
Great, thank you. Speaking of, somebody wants to know if you could go a little bit more into the concept of oracles, maybe some concrete examples of how this takes form in the industry.
Yeah, so this discussion of oracles, oracles are how we recognize problems. So they are, I'm not going to go into it too much because this is a whole other subject on its own, but you basically, anytime you run a test, you have to have an oracle. And an oracle is just a way, it's a mechanism or principle that we use for recognizing problems. There are oracles around like, so anytime you do a comparison, that you compare output of one thing to another, you are using like a comparison or consistency heuristic or oracle. So you're using one application to compare it to another. That is your oracle. So in the example of like most UI automation, we're just telling it the right answer. So as a human, we're not comparing something, but a human has already figured out, a person has already figured out what the correct answer should be, what the right assertion is. And we're just going, listen to me, I know what this is. Here is how we recognize the problem, I know this. There are all kinds of different oracles. Some are based on Michael Bolton and James Bach's consistency heuristics, like consistent with our history or consistent with our industry, or consistency between like past versions of a product and new versions of a product. There's all kinds of things like mathematical constraints. So like if you think about like how would you recognize if there was a problem with the zip code in the United States? Well, in the United States, it's either a 5-digit zip code or a 9-digit zip code. That's all it can be. And it has to fit into those because those are the rules of the road. Like that's what the United States Post Office set up. So that's one way you could recognize a problem, because somebody's come up with something, there's like a harder or concrete system for determining right or wrong. So that's a little bit about oracles, but again, that's a whole talk in itself. So I suggest definitely looking into that.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question, so this person wants to know if you can name a few tools that are used to automate testing.
I will not do that. So you should, anytime we're talking about tools, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, some of them have brand name tools associated with them, some of them do not. Some of this stuff on like observing what is happening under your system, we're talking about you writing, individuals being able to write like bash scripts, or like finding things on GitHub, scripts that kind of help them observe and understand, or grepping through logs. There are so many tools. People tend to jump when they start listing tools, and I might do the same thing of listing like name brand tools that are used for controlling software. And really the whole point of this talk is to remember that there's things for reporting, for analyzing, for observing, for designing, and controlling. So I'm not going to list any names of tools. No
worries. Let's just move on to the next question. This person wants to know who should automate component and integration tests?
Who should automate them? The person best for the job, of course. There's another generic answer. So this is going to depend on, there's the question of who should do it. And there's also the question of like who is actually capable of doing it, or who wants to spend the time on it. So if you're a fan of the book Accelerate, which is a book, can you see if I hold it up here? This is by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim, where they went through and analyzed, I think, like 5,000 companies that I think it's some large number of companies, and looked for high-performing teams. Most of the teams that were high-performing with regard to test automation around presumably component integration tests, those would be developers. So they found a correlation that high-performing teams tended to have developers writing things like component and integration tests. But not every company is a high-performing company, and not every company has time for their developers to do that. And that also doesn't mean that a tester, if they have the time or desire, shouldn't do it. So another generic answer. It depends.
Great thing. Yeah, it depends.
It depends.
Can you tell us the name of that book again?
It's called Accelerate. I'm just going to hold it up right here.
Gotcha.
Accelerate. Building and scaling high-performing technology organizations. It's a good book.
Awesome. All right, so next question. Should we keep web and mobile automation projects different when there are more changes in UI designs between the same website when it opens in a web browser versus a mobile browser?
It's a very specific question. Should we keep web and mobile automation projects different when there are more changes? I would say this depends, but probably. There's some context that's missing behind this question, I think, about actually how you have it set up. So if the person that asked this question wants to chat with me and share more details, I could probably give you a more specific answer. And that goes for everyone. If the questions that I've answered are not specific enough, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a couple more questions to see. So this person wants to know, do you think that proprietary tools era is ending or declining?
If you had asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said yes. But now, no, it's actually, so I think there's an ebb and flow to this, where you tend to have a lot of open source tools that come out. I would still say that there's a lot of open source tools that are out there that are getting better, especially when we kind of look at this visualizing. A lot of the design tools out there are open source. A lot of like the tools for observing and analyzing, I think, are open source. But when you get into control, there's a lot more proprietary tooling that's involved. With the advent of a lot of AI and machine learning, we're seeing a lot, like I see a lot more proprietary tools taking off. There's a lot more of an investment in that. So I don't think it's declining. I think there's an ebb and flow, and I think we're flowing back to more proprietary tools, just depending on what you're looking at.
Gotcha, thank you. This person wants to know, what do you think about mixing UI testing with Selenium and API requests and end-to-end automation in order to set a state of application?
So mixing the different interfaces with regard to setting the state of an application. So it depends on your goal. If your goal is to just have a set of scenarios where you step through and you test the flow of all these things, you'd probably want to keep those all at the UI. But if you're more concerned about functionality, or even just like in the example that I like to use because it's familiar to me, if you're like in an e-commerce checkout, you always need to pay attention to the scope of what you're trying to automate. That's again part of this whole parts of the testing process. So if the scope of the thing that you wanted to test is, say, example, a checkout flow, you don't really care how the item gets into your cart. You just want to have an item in your cart and then check out. So if you get that item into your cart through an API request, totally fine, because the goal of that test is to just test checkout. So it depends on what your goal is. If your goal for some reason is to just like walk through the whole thing because you think that it's prone to errors and you want to catch those, then you should do that. But again, it just depends on what your purpose is.
Great, thank you. Our next question wants to know, can we use control part for also the backend applications?
Yes. So backend applications, that's what we're talking about at the service and API layers, and even within the database. So I'm assuming backend application people, I think, tend to refer to backend as like APIs and services and databases and that kind of thing. Yeah, that's the kind of, you found something I'm missing. That's great. So yeah, databases as well. If you're running scripts or webhooks or any of those things, like interacting with a database, you might even observe things by importing some data into an application and then checking the database to see if that's where it ended up. So yes.
Well, awesome. Chris, thank you so much for this presentation and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Well, thank you for the chance. I appreciate it.
Yep. No worries. And, welcome back to Odyssey again. We really, really liked having you for the second time. So again, it was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and thank you to our audience for the great questions. We couldn't have done it without you guys. We have one more session for today, so join us for the Cobaton Innovation Panel that is starting very soon, and we'll see you there.